They may have thought about it, and some papers may have done something about it, checking their facts, that is. But journalism with a public purpose isn't just about getting the facts right.
Somebody once said to me, who's going to employ someone who's won a prize on journalism ethics? Very few people, in fact. Ethics is what happens late on a Friday afternoon on journalism courses.
Mike Jempson, director of the MediaWise Trust, an independent watchdog set up to help people who see themselves as victims of the press get some kind of redress. He also trains journalists and worries about one part of the press that's fast losing any civic purpose: local newspapers.
Sometimes they are being produced in towns that are not the towns they're actually representing, so they may be many miles from their audiences. But they're not putting resources into watching what's happening in the juvenile courts, in the family courts, what's happening inside the town hall, and in the health service, and in education. And because it requires effort, time, resources, nobody's doing it anymore. People are increasingly frightened of, or in some way alienated from, journalists and the media. There's a sense, and I've seen this particularly amongst young Muslims, they don't think that the local paper is something that they can approach. They don't think it's theirs or it's part of their lives. I sometimes wonder whether how many of the young journalists of now want to change the world, which is often the way a lot of us got into the business.
The picture you paint of local journalists becoming increasingly out of touch with the local communities, and the local newspapers becoming increasingly out of touch with the local communities, to what extent is that true, do you think, of the national press?
I think you've only got to look at a local story that's gone national to see the difference that it makes. For instance, the recent reports about suicides in Bridgend. The people who pick up on those stories at a national level have no sense of responsibility at all, it seems to me. So on the Bridgend suicides, for instance, we saw stories that haven't been properly researched have a currency. And I think that doesn't help anybody feel any responsibility to readers.
Whether locally or nationally, the financial squeeze produces something close to fear and a long way from public purpose.
There is a tendency, when your sales are going down, to revert to type, to panic, to use extreme politics and aggressive headlines to try and grab back readers that you've lost.
David Yelland, the former editor of The Sun, offering an amazing insight into how cynical some of the press can become.
I am a passionate believer that there is something very positive and great about Britain. But as a nation we have an Achilles heel, and our Achilles heel is we have a tendency towards mass depression. And you can make money as a newspaper proprietor by pandering to that Achilles heel, and it does work, but the cost of it is to belittle the political process, to make it look as if anyone that goes into politics or anybody that tries to stand up and do something for altruistic reasons is somehow weird and odd and ought to be slammed down. And I'm afraid that has had a negative effect on politicians and on all of us.
Pessimism, negativity, and belittling the political process. In the end, it was too much for David Yelland. He left The Sun for public relations, a career that tends to stress the positive. Martin Moore of the Media Standards Trust doesn't like the newspaper's high-octane tactics either, but he can see some merit in them.
There is a tone that the press takes. It tends to be sceptical, highly aggressive, and somewhat hysterical. And to a certain extent, one could argue that this is positive because it raises issues to high on the agenda very quickly, brings them to people's attention very fast. At the same time, it can alienate many people from the debate itself because they're either scared to participate themselves or because they just don't want to engage in something of such high tempo and such hysteria.
The result? The press is in a vicious feedback loop. The less we trust it, the fewer papers we buy. Circulation is down 11% on 5 years ago, and advertising is down 5% too. The tighter the finances, the more the press reverts to an aggressive and negative type, as David Yelland told us, and so it loses more of our trust, we buy even fewer. But that's not the only reason newspapers are edging closer and closer to self-inflicted public irrelevance. There's another loop, the Westminster one. We, the public, on the outside, our elected representatives, and political journalists like Kamal Ahmed on the inside.
We needed them and they needed us. I think what's interesting is that when you are working in the lobby, as all political editors and political journalists do on the Westminster scene, is trying to think about the public as your audience rather than Westminster as your audience.
Do you think, on the whole, political journalists got that right in your era, thinking about the public?
Yes, I do. I think that there's a lot of criticism about journalism, which I think is ill-founded, in that they live in this Westminster bubble, they're obsessed about process and about issues that are only of importance within SW1. I think that was an unfair criticism.
Did you never worry that you were perhaps getting too close to number 10?
No, I didn't. I mean, it was an important part of my job as political editor of The Observer to have close contact with number 10, but also we were highly critical, and stories I wrote and stories others wrote were highly critical of the number 10 machine. This idea that we would sit there and wait to be sort of dealt with like as puppets, I think is unfair.
Puppets probably is unfair, but the impression remains. We citizens feel the real business of politics is being hidden from us. But that's changing because of the internet, according to Charlie Beckett of the London School of Economics, and author of a new book, Super Media, Saving Journalism so it can save the world.
We've got a fantastically competitive media which has learned how to attract the attention of readers. But what's clear is they're now losing that attention. They have to find ways to re-engage with a kind of relevance for people's lives and the way that they're going to consume news.
But what do you think it is that's made the press lose that contact with people's lives, lose that contact, if you like, with their agenda, allowing the agenda to become, as many people say quite openly, it's just the press's agenda?
It was a very top-down process where a bunch of guys would go off and find out what they wanted to talk about, print these newspapers and put it out to the readers. And occasionally they'd get some letters back, but generally there was very little interaction. You went by what sold. There wasn't really any communication between the people making the stuff and the people consuming it. And that's got to change because they're not consuming it. We've got to find out what they want, and we've got to start delivering it with them as well as for them. And that's the important change. And that's the point of the new public journalism, the more network journalism, is that in a sense you're sharing the responsibility because you're trying to ask the public what interests them, and therefore you're actually having a discourse, if you like, which is more about the way they live their lives rather than just how a bunch of journalists think they might live their lives.